The speaker, there's three things that a speaker should be: entertaining, informative, and done. So we'll try to keep it reasonable. Now, you know what happens when a speaker takes his wristwatch off? You think he's watching the time? No, it just means he has a wristwatch. My son's passed out what I'll call a opinion survey. They're not right and wrong answers on this, but when we get through or as we go along, you can look at it. I'll just give you a little heads up on what we're going to do. I'm going to let you rank each one of those topics that we talk about by how much of an impact you think it would have had if it had been executed, and then how high a degree of success you think it might have had. So something might have had a very high impact if it had happened, but the chances of it happening may have been very low. So just use 3, 2, 1. 3 for the highest, 1 for the lowest. And you don't have to fill out a thing if you want to, but I just thought it might be kind of fun if you want to take a look at that and do it as we went along. Now let me get my remote here so we can get going. There are a lot of topics that we could explore, and some that you probably have thought about many times yourself, and some that perhaps you don't know about, and these are some of the ones that I think that we'll take a look at today. I'm of the school of thought that says, and I'm not original on this, the historian Richard McMurray, I think, is the most advocate proponent of it, strenuous advocate of it. The war could have been won in the East, but it was lost in the West. You have to think about that a little bit while. But I think that's true. Could have been won in the East, it was lost in the West. We'll talk about some things today that maybe will make you think about that. I've also passed out a recommended reading list, one on each table, with some resources by each topic we're talking about. So feel free to take a look at that. You might find some of those things interesting. First, I want to talk about examples of incidences versus decisions. An instance was something that happened because of a set of circumstances. It wasn't propelled by somebody making a specific decision. So here's some examples. The death of Albert Sidney Johnson at Shiloh. Many people said that was a devastating blow. He was the highest ranked officer in the U.S. Army at the time. When he resigned and joined the Confederate Army, he was very highly thought of, very skilled, and many people felt that was just a really terrific blow right at the front of the war. You may know he bled to death on the field where he probably didn't need to, but he was continuing to direct the troops and wouldn't let his staff get him off his horse and put a tourniquet on his leg. Another, of course, is the lost order before Antietam, and we'll circle around and touch on that again a little bit. But I think you know that story with one of the copies of Lee's order indicating how he wanted the troops to move, and which corps where was found wrapped around 3 cigars, and brought to McClellan, and McClellan then knew what Lee's total strategic plan was. Death of Stonewall, again, something that was certainly had a huge impact, but it wasn't a decision, it just happened. Lee sick at the Battle of North Anna. If you've not read about that, I encourage you to do so. That's a very interesting situation there. Lee had the opportunity actually to crush one of Grant's corps, and he came down with terrible dysentery. Longstreet was absent because of his wound, and he didn't think A.P. Hill was up to the task of directing the entire army in the attack he had planned. Big lost opportunity there probably, but nothing over which anybody made a decision. He just got sick. And then Spring Hill, we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So here's some of the decisions that I think had played a substantial role, let's put it that way, whether it had an impact or not, but it played a substantial role. And these are the ones that we'll explore today. After, I'm sure all of you probably been to Malvern Hill. Malvern is, let me get my pointer out here too. Malvern is to the north of this particular map here. So it's off the map up here. How many of you been to this particular plantation? I've probably been to Westover, Berkeley. I expect most of you have, yeah. How many of you been to Malvern Hill? Most of you been to Malvern Hill? I would hope so. All right, I want to ask for a show of hands. Please go to Malvern Hill if you haven't been there. Once Lee was able to force McClellan back from Malvern Hill, McClellan decided he'd had enough, and he evacuated the whole army down here near Harrison's Landing in order to put them back on board ship on the James River and take them back downstream. That was the last of the 7 days campaign. Pelham, the gallant artillerist that fought with Stuart, was leading part of the advance with Stuart cavalry, and he came to some heights here at Evanston. I have a hard time saying it too. There's where he arrived, just next to the plantation, overlooking Harrison's Landing, really overlooking Harrison's Landing. And he realized that there was just a very small force that was here. In fact, it was just a squadron of Yankee cavalry. He quickly drove them off. And he realized that he could see the whole Federal Army down here below. And so he sent word back and asked that please speed up some infantry. We've got a great opportunity here. And he sent the message to Jackson. And he waited a little while, and he waited a little while, and then he got impatient. And about 9 o'clock, he told Pelham to fire. Well, Pelham had one howitzer with him, just one of his flying battery. Pelham opened fire, and of course, lost the element of surprise. At that time, McClellan realized that he had a real problem with this high ground not being possessed by his side. Stuart updated Lee and Lee told him that Jackson and Longstreet were on the way. And at 1400, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he still held the heights there. But at that point in time, the Federals pushed him back in force. He didn't have enough strength to withhold their advance, and the infantry was still 6 miles away. And so he was pushed off the heights, and the Federals secured it. Walter Taylor on Lee's staff said that he thought this was one of the golden opportunities missed during the war. Stuart had just kept quiet, not fired on the troops down below so that he didn't disclose his presence, and then Lee, he could have brought up some infantry and more artillery. They could have probably really created havoc with the Federals down in the landing. Next what we'll look at is whether or not Lee should have held the field at Antietam. Should he have made a stand and fought like he did, or should he have retreated back on across the river? Now, there were a number of reasons to stand and fight, not the least of which was the fact that there were political repercussions. One of the primary reasons that he had crossed the river into Maryland was to try to gain a victory and persuade France and England to come in and recognize the Confederacy and therefore nullify the blockade. So had he precipitously or decided to retreat, would that have been politically astute? Would it have been furthering the gains of trying to maintain a presence in Maryland? Secondly, he remembered Mount McClellan. He remembered he had beat the socks off McClellan at 7 days. McClellan had a real case of the slows and indecision, and knowing his opponent, he thought, well, I think I'm pretty safe doing this because McClellan will not be decisive. And he'd been on a roll. The Confederate Army had started moving, had driven the Northern Army out of Northern Virginia, and things had been going well. He had a peak number of forces, and he said, why not? You know, this is, I'm thinking for him, but his thought process was, I think I can pull this off and continue to have a presence in Maryland. Of course, some of the things that had gone wrong he didn't know about, such as the lost order being transmitted to McClellan, and McClellan knowing what was going on. Now, he started finding out about that at the Battle of South Mountain and realized that something had gone awry, but still he didn't know the full extent of what had happened. So that was one consideration that would have been, I think, a factor in his pulling back and crossing the river. Another that probably came into his thinking, but he decided was not a deciding issue, was the fact that all of Jackson's corps was still at Harper's Ferry. So he did not have all of his army on the field there at Antietam to begin with. And there had been significant straggling during the course of getting into Maryland and while he was in Maryland for a variety of reasons. Won't go into that. There was poor tactical terrain at his back. He had his back to the river. He has back to the Potomac River. Now, that's not a real good position to be in if you're going to defend some ground, because you have a zero line of retreat trying to get back across the river. And finally, of course, in retrospect and hindsight, you can say he did suffer a tremendous number of casualties. As I think you all know, Antietam was the single bloodiest day of the war in terms of casualties. Let me go back to this one. How many people recognize that's a Currier and Ives print that doesn't come anywhere close to being accurate, except for the bridge. Anybody know what the bridge is? What's the bridge? Burnside's Bridge, right. Burnside's Bridge. Can y'all see? Am I in your way? I'm probably right in your way. But speaking, still there. Those are Confederate dead after the battle at Duncan Church. Here's another shot. Anybody know where that is in Antietam? It's a sunken lane. That's right. And the more Confederate dead at the sunken lane. If you have not been to the Antietam battlefield, I urge you to go. It's one of the best preserved battlefields in existence. It has changed extremely little since the time of the battle. And it's very easy to see what transpired there. And of course, Lee did suffer horrendous casualties, and had it not been for A.P. Hill's division double timing from Harper's Ferry onto the field, he could well have suffered just a total defeat there. Well, the next one we want to look at, and we were talking about this at the table a little bit, is the replacement of Braxton Bragg, a possible replacement of Braxton Bragg. Who was the general's favorite? The federal. I'm getting all over myself here. Excuse me. Who was the Federal's favorite general? Braxton Bragg, the Confederate general. That's the saying anyway, because Bragg just didn't have it together in many ways. And we'll talk about a few of those right now. After the Battle of Chickamauga, which was a distinct Confederate victory, but not a complete victory, in that Bragg failed to follow up at the end of the battle when he probably could have crushed Rosecrans, there was a great deal of controversy. Who did what? Who didn't do what? A lot of finger pointing. Forrest went in and told him after the battle he'd never serve under Bragg again. Bragg was so incompetent. Bragg blamed General Polk, General Hindman, and General D.H. Hill for failing to execute his orders. That's highly questionable. His orders may not have been as clear as they should have been, and he certainly wasn't very good at leading from the front. On September 30th, after the battle, it was in late September, he sacked Polk and he sacked Hindman, fired them both. Polk wrote to Jefferson Davis claiming that he had been made a scapegoat for Bragg's errors and failure. And this is not the first time that criticism of Bragg had been going on. A lot of people criticized Bragg from having retreated out of Tennessee. And in the course of the entire months leading up until this battle, there had been a lot of dissatisfaction by his officers as to how he was leading the Army. So Davis ordered Bragg to reinstate Polk after getting Polk's communication, but Polk said he refused to serve under Bragg again. He just wasn't going to do it. This, of course, is Bragg here. Now, this is General Hardee. So Davis asked Hardee if he would take command of the Army. First asked him if he would take over a corps, which he did. D.H. Hill demanded an inquiry since he felt he'd been insulted, and that was denied. And so he left the Army and doesn't show up again until towards the end of the war at the Carolinas. In the meantime, Longstreet wrote Secretary of War Seaton and later communicated the same thing to Lee. And here's what he said regarding replacing Bragg. Our chief has done but one thing that he ought to have done since I joined this Army. You remember that Longstreet's entire corps was transferred from Virginia over to Tennessee and took part, and in fact, the decisive part in the Battle of Chickamauga. I'll start again. Our chief has done but one thing he ought to have done since I joined his Army. That was to order the attack on the September 20th. All other things that he has done he ought not to have done. I am convinced that nothing but the hand of God can save us or help us as long as we have our present commander. Now there's a rousing endorsement for you from none other than Longstreet. And he conveyed the same sentiment to Lee. There was a meeting of the senior officers then at that time. They drew up a petition and asked Davis to remove Bragg. So here you've got a fairly significant group of his officers, his general officers, writing a petition to President Davis saying, please get rid of Bragg. Davis decides the best thing he can do now is he can go to the Army and see what's going on and make a decision. So he arrived on the 9th of October and he convenes a meeting at headquarters so he can discuss this with the dissident generals. And guess who else he asked to the meeting? General Bragg. So here he is to go out to make a judgment about Bragg, answer the complaints of these officers, and he asked Bragg to the meeting. Now, how's that going to work? He decides that he's going to offer the Army to General Pemberton of Vicksburg fame. And that almost created a mutiny. Pemberton was not very well thought of, particularly after Vicksburg, as you can imagine. So then he offered it to Longstreet. And Longstreet said, no, he doesn't want to do it. Then he offered it to Hardee, I mentioned before. Hardee does take command or in Atlanta for just a very brief period of time before Hood takes over. But Hardee said, no, thank you, I don't want this either. And it's a slippery eel that I want to get. So then it is suggested that he call Johnson back, Joseph Johnson, to take over the Army. That interchange between Davis and Johnson is not recorded, but as you all may know, they did not have a good history together. And that was why Johnson had been relieved back a ways and why he was kind of really out of grace with Davis. And so, not knowing what else to do, he left Bragg in command. There's a decisive action for you. The Battle of Missionary Ridge, Bragg is soundly beaten and has to retreat. And then at that time, Hardee was offered the command of the Army. He declines, and so he finally asked Johnson to come back and take over. And of course, at that time, the Confederate Army is in retreat towards Atlanta and will not stop until they get to Atlanta. And we'll talk about Atlanta in just a minute. There's Longstreet. So that's quite a conundrum of events there about whether Bragg should have been removed or not. And I think we probably have decided opinions on that. This is probably, I think, one of the most interesting things that occurred, and it did not come to light for a very long time. And some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may not. This was General Claiborne's recommendation to start enrolling and creating regiments of black troops. And he had a meeting with some of his fellow officers, and they drew up a letter. And he was not alone. He had quite a few officers that signed this letter, and I have seen a copy of it. And said, we need to enroll black troops. Our manpower situation is terrible. We just have got to fill the ranks, and I think this needs to be done. So he submitted it to Johnson, who had the Confederate Army at that time. Johnson didn't want to send it forward. He said, no, I'm not going to send this forward. But General Walker, one of the division commanders, thought that it ought to be sent forward, and so he sent it directly to Davis and said, you need to consider this. Secretary of War Selden comes back and says, no, we're not going to do that. And in addition, I want you to destroy all the copies of this petition that were written. I don't want any evidence of it. Now, we do know that there were black soldiers at the Confederate Army. This particular illustration was in Harper's Weekly. You may have seen it before. And this is purportedly to have been something that a federal officer on the north bank of the Rappahannock at Fredericksburg saw through his binoculars looking at the Confederate picket line on the south bank. He said, I saw these black soldiers picketing the Confederate picket line, and this was what was drawn by an illustrator as a result of what he said he had seen. But it wasn't until November of '64 that Lee wrote Davis and said, our manpower situation is desperate. We do need to see if we can't form black units. And then it wasn't until March of '65 the action was taken. And of course, then it was too little too late. Although there were some few black units that were formed. And according to my friend Greg Eanes, who's written a couple of books on Lee's retreat, they performed admirably protecting the wagon trains during Lee's retreat. A copy of the petition, interestingly enough, did not come to light until 1896. So, although there was word of mouth discussion about what had transpired, it was not until then that there was actual physical proof that Claiborne and these officers had made that recommendation. Well, as I say, they retreated all the way back to Atlanta. Johnson was fired by Davis. They never got along. He felt Johnson was giving up too much ground, and it had a defeatist attitude, so he replaced Johnson with Hood. My personal opinion was Hood was an outstanding brigade commander. He was a good division commander. He was an okay corps commander, and he was not a good army commander. However, he did come up with one conception during the siege of Atlanta that had some promise to it. This shows you, rather in general fashion, I'll have to admit, Atlanta and the Federal Army surrounding most of Atlanta, and then the Confederate Army here you see in red. The Confederate cavalry made a scouting expedition on the flanks. They did that routinely, and they discovered that part of Sherman's army was on the move, coming around here, all the way around, coming around here. It was Howard's corps trying to execute a surprise flank movement. So Hood went to a couple of his corps commanders. One was Stephen D. Lee, who was the youngest lieutenant general in the Confederate Army. He was only 30 years old. He had commanded artillery in the Army of Northern Virginia, and he had fought Sherman to a standstill at Chickasaw Bayou before Vicksburg. So he had a very good combat reputation. The Confederate cavalry made this report, and Hood decided that he might be able to set a trap, that perhaps he could move one corps into a blocking position in front of Howard and then attack his rear with the second corps. So he called on General Stuart to move into a blocking position, and the Lee to wait the block was done and then swing around and attack him from the back. Well, it was working pretty well. Sherman and Hood were riding along together. Howard and Sherman marching along together, riding along together. And Sherman says, I think you're going to be fine. And Howard says, no, I think Hood's going to attack me. And Sherman said, no, he's not going to attack you. He's not that audacious. Just go ahead. You'll be fine, and we'll link up with you later. The idea was the rest of the army would link up with it. Well, Howard wasn't real sure about that himself, so when he went in to camp at his first position, he decided to fortify. The Confederates got into proper position here, and Hood had given General Lee very specific orders down here: don't attack Howard. Let me say it again, General Lee, don't attack Howard. That's my directive as General Hood, the commander of the army. You wait until Stuart gets behind him, and then you can attack from front and rear, and you'll crush him. It really had a pretty good concept to him. Well, Lee got out in front, saw some of Howard's advanced troops, thought he had an opportunity, and so he attacks. Doesn't wait for Stuart to get in position. He attacks, he launches a frontal assault, he launches it piecemeal, he launches 2 divisions against 2 corps. 2 Confederate divisions against 2 Federal corps. And of course, Howard had entrenched. This shows the Federal line behind some breastworks firing it on the advance of the Confederates there at Ezra Church. And it failed miserably, and not only that, they suffered horrendous casualties. Walthal's division suffered 152 officers lost and 1,000 men. That was just one of his divisions in Walthal's divisions. Well, we're going to look at just one other thing here, and that's options at Franklin. How many of you have been to Franklin? Okay, yeah, yeah. Have you seen that, Barbara? That cemetery? Catholic cemetery. If you haven't seen that cemetery, go. If you don't see anything else at Franklin, go to that cemetery. It's the most poignant cemetery I think I've ever visited. It's just, I don't know, it really gets to you. And the setting, and it's very, it's just, it hadn't been messed with, maybe a way where I put it. Very plain and very simple. I'll encourage you, I mentioned Spring Hill as being an incident, not a decision. Take some time and read about what happened at Spring Hill. I'm not going to go into it, but that was a prelude to Franklin. And one of the reasons that caused Hood supposedly to do what he did was a missed opportunity at Spring Hill. Forrest has scouted ahead. He reports that the Federals have a very strong position here in Franklin, and if you've seen the ground there, you know that's the high ground there. He said it's a very strong position. Certainly, it's not something that we need to attack. And what's the rush anyway? Because all the army wasn't up. And Cheatham and Cleveland chimed in with Forrest and said, no, the last thing we want to do is make a frontal attack. It's too strong a position. And Forrest came to Hood and said, give me 1 division of infantry and I'll take my cavalry, and we'll swing around here and go around here, and I think we can outflank them. And you won't have to attack here. And Hood said, no, he's not going to do it. He's going to attack. He accused the army of being cowardly back at Franklin and after Atlanta, and he was going to test their mettle and make sure that they drew some blood. And so he launched this frontal attack. Now, let me ask you a question. How many men were in Pickett Pettigrew's charge at Gettysburg? Any ideas? Some guesses?
1,500?
How many here?
Was it 1,500? I think I just read that.
Other guesses?
5,000?
Best guess is 13,000.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, 13,000. Pickett's division had 5,000. Pettigrew's was probably something similar. And then there were various sundry other units. So the numbers varied from 10 to 15. 13 seems to be the consensus, 13,000. Before the attack at Gettysburg, as you know, Alexander fired a huge artillery barrage. Unfortunately, most of it overshot the Federal lines, but they had he had like 120 guns firing. Hood had 1 artillery battery. The rest of the artillery was back with the trains. He would not wait for the artillery to come up to even make a preparation here. 20,000 men made this assault, more than at Gettysburg. 20,000 men made that attack, and it failed. The Federals did finally pull back. There's Claiborne leading his men. He was one of 6 generals killed during the attack. If you've been to the house there on the battlefield before, somebody bought it and put a fence up around it. I don't know whether you got there before then or not, Barbara. I was able to walk on the porch. Those generals were laid out on the porch of that house after the battle. All of them laid out on that porch. That's how thick the Confederate dead were. Of course, this is an artist's rendering, but more than one person said you couldn't walk on the ground without stepping on bodies. And it was that bad. Well, let me go back here. I'm getting ahead of myself. All right, Richard, let me see how I get back here. Let me get a technology challenge. I don't know how to do it other than this. Sorry. So those are some decisions that I think could have made a difference if the decision had gone the other way. Now, look at your little papers. See what you think. I'd just be interested in some feedback from you all. And I say, if you think it would have had a high impact on the outcome or the direction of the war, put a 3 down. If you don't think it would have made much difference one way or the other, make it a 1. And if you're not sure, make it a 2. And then, how much of a chance of success was it? Very good chance of success, not much chance at all. All right, I'm looking for some opinions. Who'd like to venture an opinion or two?
Well, I would have loved to have seen Bragg kaput, because I blame him for the Army of Tennessee.
I think you got a lot of company.
He demolished.
Yeah, I think you've got a lot of company, yeah.
By the way, I was chatting with you.
Yes, I mean, more than one officer said if he had aggressively pursued after Chickamauga particularly, he could have crushed Rosecrans because they had him totally routed. So, yeah, of course, people say that Thomas's stand at Snodgrass Hill did slow down the pursuit and probably did save the Union Army, but still in all, I think he could have done it. Another thought or two. Opinion. Don't y'all be bashful. No right or wrong answers. All right.
Do you think that, well, in the case of Bragg and several of them, that they just had these tremendous egos to think that they could pull off some of these things, which were ridiculous?
I think that very much came in play. I think that's a very astute observation.
They wanted to make their mark.
Yeah, exactly.
Legacies, I don't know.
And some impetuosity. We shared a table. Jeb the Fourth was a dear friend of mine. Many of you knew him. We did a lot of things together. We chaired the Centennial Convention here together in '96. So I had to be careful what I said around him about his great-grandfather. But Stewart was impetuous there. He jumped the gun. And so, yes, I think and I think the ego thing with Bragg, certainly.
Bragg.
Yeah, definitely. Any other thoughts? I want to step down here so y'all can move on. I won't take too long. Well, I'll give you my thoughts for what they're worth. Stewart there at Evanston Heights, I think the impact would have been 2. I think it would have caused a great deal of disruption to McClellan's army, but I think it would have been a temporary respite for Lee because the North had enough manpower resources. They would have reconstituted things. But it would have certainly helped in a lot of ways. I think the chances of success were high. If he just bided his time, I think they could have pulled it off very easily. Holding the field at Antietam, I'm like this. I don't know. You weigh the pros and cons. I don't know whether Lee made the right decision or not. He did suffer an awful lot of casualties making the stand there. Replacing Bragg, I'm like you. I think that's a no-brainer. That should have been done, and I think it would have had a huge impact if it had happened. Claiborne's recommendation, no question, that would have had a huge impact if it had happened. They'd started forming units a year ahead of when they did. But the chances of success were zero because of the political atmosphere, feeling at the time. Even though there were quite a few officers that signed that petition. You can pull a copy of it and look at it, you'll see. Ezra Church, I think that was very doable, and I think it would have had a substantial impact. I think it would have stymied Sherman in Atlanta, maybe past the critical 64 election. That was, a pivotal point is whether Lincoln was going to be reelected in the fall of 64. The fall of Atlanta guaranteed that he would be. Had Atlanta not fallen like that, it might have been up for grabs. And then the options at Franklin, I think at Forrest's recommendation been followed, I think it would have had a substantial impact, but I think the element of success would have been iffy because Forrest would have had his work cut out for him coming around the side there and doing that. Well, thank you all. You've been patient. You've been very gracious, and I appreciate sharing with you again. And it's fun to be here with you all. Thank you.